And with us next is Carla Gangler-Nowak. Where are you, Carla? She is the Grants and Contracts Administrator in the College of Optometry. Before that, she had a similar role in the College of Medicine. She's had a lot of experience in the research community around Ohio State. And so she's going to talk to us and actually kind of, I think, help lead a discussion and answer, entertain your questions and provide her expertise about managing your research budget. That was from the, as you're starting your grant project all the way through the closeout. So let me turn it over to you, Carla.
Thanks. I actually have a slide deck. So what I thought I would do is turn that on and just start talking from the beginning, because I've got kind of philosophy of doing this and then some more nitty-gritty details about doing it. If you have questions, just throw them out there. If we don't get to the whole thing, it's fine. I can give this to Stewart and you can look through it later at your leisure. And if we get through it all, that's fine too. So just I want to make sure that your questions are answered, but that I'm actually getting to a point where maybe the question will occur to you as well. So with that, give me a second here to kind of pull this up. All right. Looking up, everybody can see what I'm presenting here. Stewart, are we good to go?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So as Stewart said, I'm Carla Gangler-Nowak. I'm the Grants and Contracts Administrator in the College of Optometry. Previously, I was in the College of Medicine. And before that, I was a sponsored program officer with the Office of Sponsored Programs. So I've got quite a bit of experience in biomedical grants. So I think the first question is what exactly your research budget portfolio is, because it's not just one grant, it's all the funding that's available to you to get your research done. And I think that it's useful to divide your research funding into two big buckets. The first bucket is the restricted funding. So these are the funds that have strings attached. So external grants like for the American Heart Association or NIH are managed by the Office of Sponsored Programs, and they definitely have strings attached. There are internal grants as well, like Pelotonia. Also, there's a scope of work, there's an expectation how you're going to spend the money, so strings. And there might be other sources of funding that you have access to, like maybe there's a gift program that has to be spent in a particular way. So there's some restrictions there as well. But there's also unrestricted funding. So this would be like your startup funds would be unrestricted. And maybe you have other little pots of money like residual funds that are unrestricted as well. So there are things that are in common when you're managing these funds, like knowing what you're spending and how you're spending it. But then there are things that are not common to restricted and unrestricted funding, like the presence or absence of different terms and conditions. Regardless of whether there are restrictions or not, you do need to properly steward all your funds. So again, following terms and conditions for all of your funding sources, like how you can spend, what the reporting requirements are. There's generally an approved scope of work that goes along with a pot of money too. You also need to spend the money appropriately, and this is both by cadence, so spending money over the length of time that you have available to spend the money. And that rate at which you're spending money is generally seen as a proxy for how you're getting your science done. So if the spending is really, really slow, a funder is going to think that the work is going really, really slowly. So they do look at this to see that you are actually getting your work done, and do that by looking at your spending rates. Also, how much of the money are you spending? So underspending and overspending are just two problems, or both sides of the same coin. So underspending your money is generally a problem because the question is, are you getting the work done that you said you were going to do? Also, if you are getting all your work done, where are the expenses? Are they on the grant that the scope of work is for, or is somebody inadvertently spending money from a different source for the grant, that scope of work that goes with the grant? So the expense is in the right place. And then this one kind of goes all the way back to the beginning when you were planning your proposal. It is possible that you completely overestimated how much money you're going to need to get that scope of work done. So that over budgeting is a problem as well, which is why we want to make sure we're doing that properly on the front end. Overspending is the other side of the coin. And again, if you're overspending, one of the questions I would have as somebody looking at your grant is all these expenses that are on there, are they on the right grant? Are they on the right funding source? Or did you mean to put expense A here, or should it be on your startup funds, for instance? You might have under budgeted at the proposal stage. It happens. We try our best to make sure this doesn't happen, but it does happen sometimes. And the reason it often happens is because things are just not going the way you expected they were going to go. So if you are at that point where you're overspending because things just aren't going according to plan, you're having a lot of trouble, this is a time when you might be wanting to talk to your program officer or your science contact at your sponsor to kind of keep them in the loop about what's going on. So this is a lot of stuff you've got to keep track on, and you're not doing it on your own. I will say that the principal investigator is always ultimately responsible, but you have got a team of people who should be supporting you. First of all, is your sponsor program officer at the Office of Sponsor Programs for external funding. You likely have a grants manager in your department or at least in your college. And if you don't, your department administrator is going to be somebody that you're working with as well for your grants management. So, but sponsor program officer are really important, and your grants manager. So know who these people are. And if you have not done so yet, introduce yourself, find out who they are, talk with them, have a Zoom meeting at minimum. It's nice to have an in-person meeting too, if you can manage that. Because what you want to do in that meeting is find out who they are, what the expectations are for the relationships, like what do they expect that you are responsible for doing, and what can you expect that they should be responsible to do? Because this is not like some set, hard and fast rule. I do an awful lot for my faculty in the college here. But what I do for faculty in my college is going to be very different from what, say, a grants manager in the College of Medicine is going to do for faculty that they work with. So make sure you know what that relationship is and what you can expect out of each other before you get too far down the path. You also have tools in addition to people for managing your funding. So the first tool, and I just want to step back and say, I know we converted to Workday. I know that there's been challenges with that conversion. And some of our tools have not been as rock solid as before conversion. That all being said, the first tool I still recommend people, the faculty especially, would go to is the PI portal, which is on the OSP homepage. So this again is for your external grants, which is what I'm going to really focus on in this presentation. As the PI portal has got your award terms and conditions listed there, so you could see what you're expected to do with regard to spending, any restrictions, anything you have to do, and as well as your financial information for each of your grants. So both at an overview level, so like how much money do you have left right now, and at a detailed level, like what did I spend money on? You know, like how are my people, who's appointed to this grant? You know, what are the purchase orders that are associated with that sort of thing? Okay, so that is all in the PI portal. Your second source is Workday. If you go to log into Workday, there's that home page where you've got those little worklets on the right-hand side, like you could take your vacation leave and such. There is another worklet there called the PI summary. That worklet, if you click on it, is going to give you access to 3 different tabs. The tabs that I think you probably find most useful right now, the ones that I'm going to concentrate on, are the grants detail. The grants detail tab, which is the one I've outlined in green on the screen, gives you kind of a PI portal type information. So for each of your grants, so you would type in which grant you're interested in looking at in the grants detail, and it gives you PI portal type information. I'm going to show you screenshots of what the top level report in the grants detail looks like later on in this presentation, so you can kind of see the difference between the two, which is very minor. The biggest difference is that PI portal is fed once a day, whereas the grants detail in Workday is live data. So they might be a little bit different because Workday is just more up to date. The other really important tab here that I want to point out is the faculty financials tab, and I just outlined that in blue. This is important because you could see your non-OSP funding here. So your startup funding, if your department is using the assignee work tag for your startup funding or any other funding that's available to you in your department, and that you could search for your assignee as name.number, and the assignee work tag starts with the letters AS, and then it has 6 digits after that. So long as that work tag is used with your department-based funding, you should be able to see your financial status in the faculty financials tab in the PI summary. So this is a pretty important one for you to check out at some point in time. And you may not have seen this because I believe they just fixed this so that it would work in the past week and a half or so. So take a few minutes if you have any startup funding to check it out and see if this is available for you in your department. Okay. So I want to take a step here just to talk about Workday for a moment. I know there's still some confusion if you don't live in Workday like I do about what it is and how you should be thinking about it. So first of all, it is the university's new financial and HR system. So this is where we do everything. We buy our goods and services, our vendors get paid, you hire people in Workday, people get appointed to your grants in Workday. All of our payroll comes out of Workday. If there's a mistake, it gets fixed in Workday. So these are all these little transaction level details that happen in Workday. That's not very helpful for figuring out how much money you have left on your grant. What you need there is a report. So a report in Workday combines all these transaction level details into one great big view, one big report. So the reports that we're talking about here are the PI summary that I was just explaining to you with that faculty financials and the grants detail. That's just, the PI summary is just a collection of reports. And again, these use live data. So if you put a requisition in and then you go check, once a requisition is approved and you go check the grants detail, it'll be in there immediately. It's in there because it's completely live. You're not going to see it immediately in PI portal because that is fed on a daily basis. The PI portal is essentially one report, and it is created using data that's extracted from Workday. So it's not Workday. Nothing happens in the PI portal. It is only a report of stuff that's happening elsewhere. Workday being the major source, but there are other Office of Research systems that feed the PI portal, like the eProtocol system or Buckeye or B. So PI portal is just an enormously complex report. Nothing actually happens in the PI portal. And again, that's updated every day. So with regards to Workday, my biggest piece of advice for you is to keep on top of your Workday tasks. Workday is sending out, I find a lot of emails to folks, and there are 2 different kinds. There are tasks and there are notifications. Notifications are just FYIs. Hey, this happened. Okay, this was successfully completed, something along those lines. Frankly, I even ignore those for the most part because they generally don't mean I have to do anything. If you have a Workday task, on the other hand, it means that you do need to log into Workday and take care of it, because if you don't do the task, whatever it is that's happening comes to a screeching halt until you do it. So what I have found is that sometimes faculty aren't monitoring the tasks and things get delayed. Like if you put in a requisition and something isn't quite right on it, or there's a question or your justification wasn't complete enough, and the person who reviewed it sent it back to you, you're going to have a task saying you have to go review that and fix it up. But if you're not looking at your tasks and you don't know about that, the requisition that you thought was in and being processed is dead with you until you fix it and move it along. Other items that get hung up if you don't approve them are things like your consulting agreements, subaward agreements, payroll accounting adjustments, like you're trying to fix personnel. You might need to approve those as well. Hires, if you don't approve stuff, you're not going to get your hire through. So make sure you're keeping on top of those tasks. And I highly recommend that you just check your email or Workday just once a day. This could be 30 seconds of your day and that's it. Or it might take you a little longer so you actually have something to do, but don't let these get away from you. So let's circle back around to, you just got a brand new grant. What do you do with it? What should you be looking out for? First thing is understanding the terms and conditions of your grant. So you want to answer questions for yourself, like how many years of funding do you have? You probably know this because you wrote the proposal, but you know, the granting agency didn't necessarily follow the proposal. Maybe you applied for 5 years and NIH cut it back to 4. Lord knows they do that enough to us. So make sure you know how many years of funding you got. And do you have it all at once or over time? If you apply for NIH funding, you are only getting 1 year at a time, and you have to do progress reports for every year to get that next year of funding. If you got NSF, on the other hand, you probably got the whole 3 years in one fell swoop. And then you've got to allocate those 3 years out over the next 3 years, and not just spend it all in the first year, right? So it really depends upon the sponsor and how they tend to do these things. You might need to submit progress reports. There's probably a final report. Know about those. Make sure that you're on top of them. You want to keep your sponsor happy because they gave you money. So we're keeping them happy. A big one that impacts how you manage your funds is whether you can carry over unspent funds from year to year without sponsor prior approval. And on kind of on the flip side of that, can you deficit spend? Can you spend more money in year one, for instance, than you have for year one, knowing that you have more money coming year two? So these are kind of flip sides of the same question. If the sponsor will not let you carry over money that you didn't spend in year one into year two, i.e. you don't have carry forward, you need to request via letter to the sponsor approval to do that. And your sponsor program officer will help you with that. But what that means on a very practical level, it means you can't deficit spend. You can't spend more in year one than you actually got in year one. And it also means you're going to get a new grant number every single year. So, and I'll show you that in just a second, but this particular thing is going to structure how your grant is set up by Office of Sponsored Programs. Okay. Another question that is sort of related is rebudgeting among line items without sponsor prior approval. Sometimes if you've got an R01 that is a modular budget, this is kind of not applicable because you're not rebudgeting much of anything. But if you've got, say, American Heart Association or some other foundation, they probably do have rebudgeting restrictions. So maybe you could rebudget 25% of your annual budget without getting prior approval. Or maybe you can't rebudget anything without prior approval. Those are a pain. So we like it if we've got some ability to rebudget because, you know, it's research, you don't know what's going to happen. Costs increase, costs decrease. So we like to have some rebudgeting approval, but this is something you should be looking at when you get a new grant. Sometimes sponsors restrict what you can buy. Pretty commonly, they'll say no tuition or no equipment. And their definition of equipment might not be the federal definition and the OSU definition, so it's something you should look at. Sometimes you've got a grant where you have to buy something. So it's required that you attend a meeting in Washington, D.C., for instance. So that's something that you should know about and be planning for. You probably budgeted for that, but just don't forget that you have to do these things. Sponsor may have restricted part of your budget to the purchase of something in particular, for instance, a piece of equipment. Maybe you got $300,000 and $50,000 is restricted for the purchase of, you know, a particular piece of equipment that you proposed. And then finally, what kind of personnel can you appoint? Sometimes it's completely open, like with NIH or NSF, but other times a sponsor will say no faculty salaries or We won't pay tuition, which means what are you going to do with your graduate students, right? So maybe that's not the sort of person you would put on this grant. So you'll have to watch out for those kind of restrictions as well. So once you understand the terms and conditions, you need to understand how these things get set up in Workday so that you can start spending. When you get a new grant or a new contract, that's an award. So that's the terminology in Workday. And the identifier associated with that starts with AWD, and then there's 6 digits. Okay, so that's the place where like your terms and conditions live. Every award has at least one grant associated with it. And grants are 6 digits preceded by GR. The grant is what you use to spend. Okay, so when you're putting in a requisition, you're going to put in that GR number, and that is going to charge your grant. Okay, so you might be asking, well, when do I have more than one grant? Well, this is where your structure comes into play. If you got a multi-year award and the sponsor requires that you get prior approval to carry over funds from year 1 to year 2, or there has to be a financial report every single year, then OSP is going to be setting this up with one grant for each year. Okay, so you'll have a new grant number for every single year of your award. If it's like an NIH R01, you're going to have the same grant number going all the way through in most cases, unless you don't want it that way. You can ask OSP to set these up differently. So what if you have an R01? It could have the same grant number, but you've got a collaborator over at a completely different college, and the two of you decided, it'd be nice if you each had your own separate pot of money. You can ask OSP to set up 2 grants, one for you and one for your collaborator, and then just divide the budget up between the 2 of them. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be aware that if your collaborator overspends, you have to underspend. So there's only still 100% of the money. When you divide it in 2, it's still got a balance at the end of the day. Okay, so, but you can request that. And sometimes OSP is going to set up other grants because there needs to be a new grant, a different grant for every subaward that's on your award. So that's another reason to have more grant numbers than just the one. So if you don't understand why you've got more than one grant associated with your award, or you're not sure, talk to your grants manager or your sponsored program officer and make sure that you get the story and you understand what that structure is, because that's going to help you know where to spend later on. So when you get your new grant, once you understand the structure and the terms and conditions, there are things you have to take care of right away. Otherwise, you're going to be going back and cleaning stuff up. Okay, so very first thing is appointing your personnel. Your personnel are the largest expense on any research project. So get to the person who is going to make sure the costing allocations are done. That's the term in Workday's costing allocation for appointing people. Figure out who that is for you. It's probably your grants manager. They need to know who to appoint to your grant, what level of effort to appoint them to your grant, and when do you start that appointment. Doesn't have to start on the first day of the grant. Maybe your person isn't finishing working up on a different grant until 1 month in or 2 months in, but you need to tell the person who's doing the costing allocation how to do it. Okay. It's helpful if you're working with part-time people, if you have part-time staff, to talk with your grants manager about how many hours per week, because it can get very confusing when you're talking about FTE and percent effort, because what you are hearing and what your grants manager is hearing may not be the same thing. So for part-time people, talk about hours per week, and then everything will be clear. Okay, that's another little tip. If you have a subaward or a consulting agreement that was in your proposal, this really needs to be done very quickly. There's a lot of steps before these get executed. And you've got to remember that the people that you're working with at the other institution or your consultant, they're waiting for their award, just like you were waiting for your award from NIH. Let's say they're waiting for their award from us. So the sooner you request those subawards and consulting agreements that you have, the better. And you can do that, but I would very, very strongly recommend that if you've got somebody like a grants manager who could help you with this or even do it for you, let them. Subawards in particular are tricky now, I'd say. They're a little, it's not hard, but if you don't do it all the time, it is hard. So like I've done quite a few of these already, so I know what I'm doing and I can get it done very quickly. But if you only do one every 3 years, it's going to be difficult. So find somebody who can help you with this. And the same thing goes for consulting agreement with this, which is a lot of back and forth. So get that done as soon as possible. If you have animal costs on your grant, make sure you get your cage charges moved over. So you have to update e-protocol. If you're paying human participants, getting petty cash is a long process. Assume that it's going to take 3 to 4 weeks the first time you try to do this. So get it started quickly if you know you're going to need to pay subjects pretty soon. And again, I can't say often enough, meet with your grants manager or your department administrator, your sponsor program officer, whoever it is who's helping you with this grant, to make sure that you understand how you're working together with this particular grant and how this is going to go and what your expectations are and what they need from you to help you get things done. There's always ongoing monitoring once you get stuff up and running. So again, meeting regularly with your grants manager is going to be a pretty important part of this, because they can help you understand what's happening in Workday and in the PI portal. Most important thing is keeping on top of your personnel. If you need any adjustments, tell your grants manager, department administrator, whoever that person is, as soon as possible. Because if you wait too long and you miss the window for fixing it in Workday, we'll have to do a retroactive transaction. That's more work for everybody, including you, because you'll probably have to approve that in Workday. And that means looking for another one of those annoying tasks, right? Another email from Workday that we don't want to have. So keep on top of your personnel and tell folks when adjustments need to be made. And I wanted so badly to jump in when Val was talking about undergraduates and Jill earlier, because this is one thing that if you have your undergraduates in particular working on an NIH grant and they are not turning in their timesheets on time, this creates a lot of work because Workday is set up such that those late timesheets are going to be cost shared, which means that somebody like me, a grants manager, is going to have to go in and do a retroactive transaction to move their salary and fringe benefits back onto the grant again. It's just the way the system is set up. We don't like it. Workday delivered it and we've complained about it. So hopefully this will get fixed. But anybody who is a biweekly paid employee, whether they're an undergraduate or a staff member in your lab, if they're in the habit of turning in timesheets late and they're on an NIH grant, they're creating problems for you and for your grants manager. So try to break them of that habit. And that means you have to sign off on those timesheets in a timely manner as well. When you have a subaward or a consultant, invoices are going to have to come in that you're going to have to approve. So you make sure you stay on top of those. And make sure you're checking your financial status regularly so you just know how much money you have. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in the PI portal and at Workday. So this is the financial roll-up screen in the PI portal. So when you look at one of your grants in the PI portal, this is the first screen you see. The first column is going to show the budget that's from the award or the proposal, depending upon the situation at hand. And it's going to be broken out by different, they're called object classes in Workday, but think of them as just line items. So salaries, fringe benefits, material supplies, travel, equipment, whatever it is. The second column is your expenses. So this is money out the door. This is payroll that's been paid already. This is, these are invoices that have been paid. So money out the door is expended. The committed is money that you intend to spend. So if you've got your lab manager appointed to this grant, the committed is going to be how much salary and fringe benefits is associated with that appointment through the end date of the grant, up to 5 years into the future. Okay. And then the balance is just what was budgeted for that line item minus what's expended, minus what's been committed. And then you've got your balance. Okay. And that goes all the way down to the bottom where you get the direct plus indirect total. Indirect is also known as facilities and administration or F&A or overhead. And this particular grant does have indirect costs. There's some that do not have any F&A. And there are others that have just a modicum of F&A. So there's different rates, and the F&A is calculated as a percentage of the direct costs. So the second to the last line in the PI portal shows you just the direct costs. So the last line is the direct total plus the facilities and administration. Again, the PI portal data, just a big complicated report, and they're always at least a day old. They load overnight. So these data are not live. If I were the PI and I put in a requisition today and it was approved today, I'm not going to see that update here in the PI portal until tomorrow. Okay. So in the PI portal, in addition to this financial roll-up tab, there's some other tabs for just your non-personnel expenses, for your payroll, and then for your commitments, non-personnel commitments. Now let's look at the same sort of view in Workday. So if you go into the PI summary and you choose the grants detail and select the same grant, by and large, it's going to look the same, by and large. But remember, Workday is live data. So when you pull up the grants detail, this is live. So in that example where I entered the requisition and it was approved today, PI portal won't be updated till tomorrow, but this view in Workday is updated immediately. Okay, so these are live data. So your PI portal view and your Workday view might be a little bit off from each other just because of that difference in timing. Okay, so you'll see that this looks largely the same as in the PI portal. This particular report is the first one at the top of the page. It's got your budget. The third column is expenditures. Fourth column, encumbrances. That's just another term for commitments. It's the Workday term. And then the balance is the budget minus the expenditures minus the encumbrances. That's your balance. The difference is this expenditures for the current period, that second column. That's just showing you your expenses for the current month or the one that you had selected in the report. Okay, so in this particular case, they've already spent $5,039.10 in salary in the current month when I ran this report, whenever that was. Okay, so that might be of interest to you, maybe it's not, but that's what this report is showing. The grants detail page in Workday, everybody knows it is slow to load. So it could take like 30 seconds, and sometimes it doesn't like to load at all because, and we've complained about this to Workday. If you want to see the most accurate data possible and it's not loading for you in the grants detail, type budget versus actuals by object class in the search, and it will pull up this little report right here that I've displayed on the screen, but it'll come up much, much, much faster. So that's your best source for the live data if grants detail is too slow for you. Does somebody have a question?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary Parker. I just had a question, like if you have a grant that's over multiple years, is there a way that you can just look at a current period? Because we have a grant that runs from November 1st to October 31st. So I was wanting to look at the current fiscal year information compared to can you separate that?
So is your grant one that they just roll the money in every year? It's the same grant number across multiple years, or does it get a different grant number every year?
It's the same grant number, the whole
same grant number. Okay. You'll have to do some math. Okay.
Okay.
So it's not crazy hard, but what I would do is don't go to grants detail. Go to budget versus actuals by object class. just run that report separately rather than as that series of reports that the grants detail is. And when you run that report, it's going to allow you to set the month, like which month do you want to look at? So if you want to look at it as of today, you can do that. But if you want to see what it looked like as of February 2021, you can do that as well. And then just transfer over to your spreadsheet and subtract. So
Is there any way that I could look at like, because we're like in our third year, so I've prior expenditures in the prior 2 years. So I'm wanting to separate what this current year expenses are. So that's what I was.
okay. The Workday is live since January, so you can't see the pre-January data, unfortunately, in Workday. Go to the PI portal. Okay. So in the PI portal, when you're on that first page, the one that looks like this, you can set your period in the upper left-hand corner. So this is just set to October. But if you want to see what it looked like last October, you probably have to switch over to the 6 series number, and there's a link at the top of the page to do that. But then you just select your period. It could be October of 2020 that you're looking at. And then you just do the subtraction. You can export to Excel and then just do your math.
Yeah, I've been doing that. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I think that's the
If there was anything that I was missing.
No, I don't think there's anything fancy that lets you do that, unfortunately. That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the best we've got for now, for one of these multi-year grants.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. All right, so we just talked about detail. All right, so let's look a little more detail at this particular award, because we should be thinking about whether there's a problem or not. We've got $56,426 budgeted for salaries and wages, and you'll notice the balance is negative. When you see the parentheses, that means negative. So should we be worried about this? Is this a problem? Same thing at the very bottom. We have a total budget of $120,866, and the balance is a negative $24.9816. Does this mean that you should be, worried about this? Question in Grantsland, or the answer in Grantsland, is almost always it depends, unfortunately. So remember when we talked about terms and conditions, that's where it matters when you're starting to make this kind of analysis. So you'll note on the salaries and wages line, we had the 56,000, right? The expenditures, the money out the door, is 33,713. So that's nowhere near what we budgeted. Where the problem is the encumbrances, right? So we haven't actually spent that money. If nothing changes, we will have a negative balance for that line item, which may or may not be a problem. For right now, though, you're totally fine. And maybe the salaries and wages is a graduate student that is leaving at the end of this semester, and that encumbrance goes away, whatever. So maybe there's no problem there. But maybe there is a long-term problem. So this really depends upon you understanding what your appointments are and what your commitments are, whether that's actually an issue for the encumbrances. But let's just say that these encumbrances, that's not really the problem. You really have overspent this line item. Is that a problem? Well, what you've done if you've overspent a line item is rebudgeted from something else into this line item. So like in this case, look, we haven't spent any of the travel, surprise, surprise, during the pandemic, but we've rebudgeted essentially out of travel into salaries and wages and fringes. Haven't spent the materials and supplies yet. So is the sponsor okay with rebudgeting? If they don't care, then it's not a problem. What you really are looking at is the bottom line in the bottom right-hand corner. Is that negative or positive? But if your sponsor does care, then I would recommend talking to your sponsored program officer before you've actually gotten to the point of overspending the line item too much, and talking about how much you can overspend those line items before you have to get sponsor prior approval. Okay, so these are things to be looking for. If you need sponsor prior approval to overspend in one line item relative to what you proposed, or you find that you are not going to be spending one line item at all because, hey, we aren't traveling. So, all that is not going to be spent. Can we use it someplace else? So if you've got to rebudget among your line items or any number of other things to talk to sponsor about, maybe you want to significantly reduce your effort. Like NIH says, if you reduce your effort by 25% or more, you need to get prior approval first. Okay, so maybe you need to do that. Maybe something happened with the research and you need to change the scope of work somewhat, depending upon how much you can change relative to what your sponsor is expecting. Like maybe you need to add a subaward. That's usually a change of scope of work. Maybe you want to buy something the sponsor is normally not too thrilled about. Like maybe your sponsor says you can't buy equipment, and we define equipment as costing $100. It's a durable item that costs $100. Well, maybe a piece of equipment that you were really relying on to get this work done broke, and it's a $200 item. You still need to get sponsor prior approval, but maybe they'll say yes. So that's a reason to go back to them. So there's any number of reasons to get prior approval from the sponsor before you proceed. But key is do it before you spend the money, because if they say no, it's an unallowable cost and you're going to have to eat it on the department side. So to do that, you're going to submit these requests to your sponsor program officer, who will officially submit them to the sponsor. You need to justify it. It's like how much you want to spend. Why do you want to do it? Do all the things to make them happy. And try to bundle your requests. If you think you're going to have more in the near future, try to wrap everything up into one request. Okay. If you're looking through your financials and you find there's a mistake, like, oh, I thought somebody had been taken off this grant, they stopped working on it, and they're still being charged to it, and they shouldn't be, and you need to get that fixed. Maybe your lab manager misunderstood when they purchased a new piece of equipment that was supposed to go on your startup and it wound up on your grant instead. Or maybe there's an expense you just don't recognize. You don't know what it is. Sometimes mistakes happen and people grab the wrong project or the wrong grant number. So just report those to your department administrator, your grants manager, so that those mistakes can be fixed, preferably within 90 days. And look out for any tasks in Workday, because you may need to do some approvals in the Workday system to get those fixed. So not the end of the world, we can get it done. Just remember, though, that having funds left over is not a reason to spend them. So transferring costs onto a grant just to use up the funds is unallowable. And OSP looks for this by looking for a lot of transfers in the last month or so of the grant. So this is something to be careful for, and it is specifically disallowed on federal grants, all grants for sure, but definitely on your federals. Okay, and as your end date is coming up, make sure you're talking with your grants manager and sponsor program officer about what you need. About a half a year before it ends, talk with them. Do you need a no-cost extension? If you've got work left over and you're going to have money left over, you may be eligible to get one. For NIH, usually the first one is just an automatic. We just tell the SPO and they take it because it's a unilateral. Other sponsors, we generally have to write a letter and request it. And if you're done with the work and it's going to be finished, you got to close it out. So you have to wrap up your spending. And remember, the closer to the end date you are, the more scrutiny those larger purchases are getting, especially equipment. If you're buying equipment, try to get that done at least 6 months before the end of the grant, because the idea is you're supposed to be using it for the grant. But if you're buying it at the end and it's really ending, then you're not using it for the grant, right? Because that scope of work is coming to an end. Make sure you move your personnel. Make sure you get your animal cage charges moved, gas cylinder costs, anything that's an ongoing expense. Make sure that gets moved off to a new funding source. Make sure you know what happens to staff. If your grant is ending and you've got hard money staff, what happens to them when the grant ends? Are they moving to a new grant? Are you going to have to let them go? So make sure you're talking with your people about that. And special case, if you get a new competitive segment for an NIH grant and there's money left over in the old competitive segment, it's going to carry forward into the new one. Eventually, it's going to take a few months, but it will get there. And finally, just the last thing I'm going to say here, it's really, really hard to spend your grant down to exactly $0. So what happens? If you've got an overrun on a cost reimbursable grant, that means you spend $1, the sponsor pays us $1, and that's most of our grants, it's definitely our NIH grants. If you have an overrun, it's going to be returned to the cost centers associated with that grant per the expenditure allocation on the PA555 that you signed at the very beginning when you proposed it. If you have money that is left over at the end of a cost reimbursable grant, it just goes back to the sponsor, goes back into their pile. Fixed price grants are more common on industry awards, like a clinical trial, let's say. And these are grants where we get X dollars to do a particular scope of work. And if there's money left over at the end, woo, you get residuals. Those come back, the direct costs come back to you. It's a bit of a slush fund for you to spend, kind of like your startup fund. So those are awesome. If you have an overrun, however, it's treated the same. It also goes back just like on a cost reimbursable grant. So residuals we really like. PAs are fond of them. And that's all I have to say. Does anybody have any other questions?
Well, thank you, Carla, for that informative presentation. I think you've got some really good information that I hope will help people in their managing of their grants.
Welcome. If any, in the future, if you don't know your grants manager, or you don't know who your SPO is, if you've got a question, you feel free to email me. I'm happy to help to the extent that I can. So
Appreciate that.